This is John Milner interviewing Dr. Elizabeth McBroom in her home in Pasadena, California on August the 3rd, 1988. Elizabeth, could you tell me how you first became interested in becoming a social worker?
Yes, I started college not knowing there was such a thing as a social worker. I had never seen a real-life social worker. My mother used to do a volunteer job of driving a probation officer around to make her home calls, but I didn't certainly identify her as a social worker or ever want to be like her. But I always fancied that I would be a journalist, and that's what I was pursuing in college. And then came the crash after my freshman year, and I began to look around and see that newspapers were laying off people. They weren't hiring anybody. And simultaneously, I became very interested in sociology courses that I was taking. One was about the family, and one was a course that I guess would be called social pathology, and I was very much interested in learning about mentally ill and crime and poverty. And I began to think then of going to graduate school because there certainly weren't any jobs for the graduates of our class. And I corresponded with the University of Chicago. There were no schools in the West either at the time. I corresponded with Western Reserve. And I was sort of incensed that Western Reserve asked me to go to Seattle to be interviewed, but the University of Chicago just accepted me out of hand. So I went there, and I had learned how to type and take shorthand, so I had a secretarial job in the school office, and became quite well acquainted with Miss Abbott and Miss Breckenridge and the other faculty there. And I worked for the first year I was there, and then I got a Commonwealth Fellowship, and so I didn't have to work for the last 2 quarters. I could write my thesis.
And your undergraduate work was all at the Washington State College?
Was at Washington State. I was an English major, yes, and I was took a great deal of interest in the school newspapers and yearbooks and spent a lot of time with them.
I've always said the English majors make the best practitioners in social work, and I believe it. You were raised in Spokane.
Raised in Spokane, through grade school and high school in Spokane. Our family was very stable. We all in our family went through 8 years in the same grade school and 4 years in the same high school, and most of our neighbors did as well.
Mm-hmm. When you went to the University of Chicago, what was the emphasis of that school at that time?
They had just brought Charlotte Toll there, and she came out of a guidance clinic in New York, and she had never taught. She was very frightened of teaching. But she sort of soldiered through, and she became quite a popular and skillful teacher.
No.
And
certainly one of the stars.
One of the stars, and she brought Ruth Gartland and Ruth Smalley there to assist her with what Miss Abbott always used to call a psychiatric social work. And I had a fieldwork assignment in the Bobs Roberts Memorial Hospital for children, and I then was asked to stay on staff, and I became the first social worker at the orthogenic school, and I stayed there and at Bobs Roberts, and then I was asked to go on the staff of the new psychiatric unit in the Billings Memorial Hospital, and I did that very reluctantly because I liked working with the children and with the families, but the adult unit also turned out to be a very fascinating experience. University had just sent Roy Grinker and Margaret Gerard to Vienna for analysis, and they came back and headed that up. And our unit had a staff meeting every day at 7 o'clock on the loft board and discussed all the cases, and then went on from there.
Did the school at that time feel that workers in the field should all have a psychoanalysis?
No, that came to me somewhat later, but there wasn't a lot of emphasis at the University of Chicago at that time on social workers being analyzed.
At a later time, it was emphasized all over the country.
Oh, very much so, yes.
When you left Chicago, you returned to the West Coast.
When I left Chicago, I went to Europe for the summer and went to an international conference and went on a bicycle trip in youth hostels in southern England and the Isle of Wight. And then I came back to Washington and landed in Grays Harbor County in the public agency there, and became the child welfare worker for Grays Harbor County.
And were you working directly with children? Or?
Yes, I was starting the first foster home program there had ever been in that county, and also I was supervising the workers who were untrained, who were AFDC workers. And it was a very exciting time when the Social Security Act was first starting. There was a lot of energy and enthusiasm and kind of pride in what we were doing. It was a very depressed time in Grays Harbor County. It's a logging community, and all the logging camps were down, and all the mills were down. It was very depressed. Our office was the busiest place in the county.
I imagine. I remember that scene very well. And you moved then from Gaines County to Kings County.
Well, I paused in Olympia for an assignment in the state office, and not as soon as I thought I was going to go, because we had a new county director. He was Brian Hankins, and he asked me to stay on as supervisor for his first 2 months and help him. And this was a very startling experience for me, because I came to work one day and found that Brian was the county director, and just within recent weeks I had rejected their application for a foster home license. But I guess I must have done something right, because we were always very good friends and worked together for a long time.
In Kings County, what other responsibility did you have?
I went on to King County, and the Division for Children, as it was called at that time in the county, in and for the county, was really a beautiful agency. It was under the direction of Virginia Trumbull, who was a very talented administrator. And each of our staff had specific responsibilities, geographical districts for foster care, home finding, and placement. And we had a great many responsibilities in the court. One worker studied all adoption cases that came through the probate court. And my particular assignment was to represent the county, the Division for Children, in juvenile court. Whenever any child was committed, we took guardianship of the child, or when any child in a family receiving public assistance appeared in court on a delinquency charge.
And you'd represent the family.
I'd represent the family and the Division for Children. And it was a very exciting time to be there. Everything was really just getting started. everybody had a great zest for the job.
Yes. Then you decided you'd like to teach?
Well, no, I really never did decide I'd like to teach. I was supervising some University of Washington students who came for the summer, and I remember two very able and outstanding girls came from Idaho on summer scholarships and did some field work in our agency. And I decided to go to New York and take Fern Lowry's Institute in Supervision. And on my way, I paused at the University of Chicago, and Miss Breckenridge asked me what I was doing and how I liked it, and I told her I was very enthusiastic about it. So she reached me in New York with word of a faculty position at West Virginia University. I think if I'd told her that I hated my job, I never would have heard from her again. And so I detoured through Morgantown on my return and did accept a position teaching there in a school that was just being organized, a one-year school.
Oh,
and I stayed there for 4 years. It was just Amos Sunley and myself who were at the school, and during that year it became accredited. Gordon Hamilton and someone else came and accredited it.
To accredit it, What courses did you teach there?
Well, I taught casework, and I taught a course equivalent to what we call behavior, and I supervised fieldwork.
Good combination.
Yeah. We did all the field work in a little public agency, and the director of it was a very temperamental and irascible woman, and would really terrorize the students and descend on them in full fury if they did anything wrong in the records or anything like that. And part of my energy went to protect the students from Mrs. Camisa. They were really quite frightened of her.
There were quite a few in the country like that.
We were in an old house, and there was I think it must have been a daycare center in part of it. And I remember one of my students, a young man from the southern part of the state, and a very good student, he later went into the federal service. And children were tearing back and forth down the hall, and he was trying to study something, and he says, "You may read a headline in the paper tomorrow, child welfare worker strangles child."
Did Dean Sunley eventually go to become dean at the University of Denver?
Yes, he did. I left before he left. The war started during that time, and after I had taught at Morgantown for 4 years, I always get a yen to get back to the West. So I went back, and that's
that
when
was back to Seattle.
Back to Olympia.
To Olympia.
And I worked there for probably about a year. The assignment that Jess Mooney had. Do you remember her?
Yes, very well.
Licensing of child placing agencies and child caring institutions. It was a very interesting job. It was statewide, and I traveled from east to west on the train and used a state car. And of course it was war and gasoline rationing. I'd always pick up soldiers in Fort Lewis and give them a ride to the city. And I remember that we were trying very hard to get qualified social workers, and they were in short supply. And one very wily young priest came to be director of service for the Diocese of Spokane. And he was opening one institution after another and didn't have any worker with training. And I remember saying to him, it's difficult but not impossible to get a worker with a master's degree in social work. And just recently they got one for the Tri-Cities, Richmond and Hanford, where we later found out they'd been making the atom bomb. And that was a very unsettled mushroom-growing community with many problems. And the next time I went over there, the Father Riley had stolen that social worker from the Tri-Cities and had installed her in the Catholic diocese. It really boomeranged. I outsmarted myself.
Yes, you did. Was that in about 1942?
It was, yes, it was about 2 years before the war ended, because I spent the last 2 years of the war in the Seattle Guidance Clinic. That was the first psychiatric agency that was organized in Seattle, I think, as a clinic.
Yes.
An outpatient clinic for adults and children.
Mm-hmm.
And remember our friend Dr. Stevens was the first director there.
Didn't he get fired for seducing his patients?
Well, he was a very troubled man, and he created a lot of trouble. And he created trouble within staff. And that was where I really began to feel that you couldn't be quite a self-respecting social worker without analysis, and that's when I left the clinic and went to Chicago and stayed there for 3 years, and during that time I worked at Herrick House, which was a research and treatment center for children convalescing from rheumatic fever, children with rheumatic heart disease. And most of them were very deprived children because other children could convalesce at home, but for some of these children, the housing and the neglect they suffered from, they had very little chance to recover if they went directly home from the hospital.
Yes. That was a famous clinic.
Well, they did a lot of research, and they had many really quite famous cardiologists and pediatricians on the staff. Irene Joslin was a consultant there, and she was very down to earth and very practical with the staff and with the young people who were the care officers, like the counselors and house mothers and so on, and really helped them a lot, I think, in their understanding of the children and their handling of them.
And it was based on psychoanalytic approach to treatment.
Well, she was a psychoanalyst, but she also had a great deal of common sense. And I remember a couple of things that stand out. One was that some young social worker that she worked with at another agency, I think, had told about going to a session and going through really hell and high water to get there because she didn't want her analyst to think that she was resistant. And Irene really scoffed at that and thought that was the most ridiculous thing in the world. She was very well tied to reality. And I also remember a young girl who came. This agency also ran a summer camp on the other side of the lake. A young girl came out to the camp, and a worker from the Jewish Family Service came out, and she had had this girl in treatment, so-called, for several years, and yet the girl came with no equipment or no clothing or anything that wouldn't make her a laughingstock of the other kids. And it seemed to me that this worker was quite blind to some of the things that were important to a teenager. And she told me of having given a paper at the national conference on her work with this case and how criticized she was for the way that she dealt with the child's Oedipus complex. And I thought this was getting pretty rarefied,
Yes. And Freud had been over to visit in this country and lecture by that time.
Everybody was hipped up.
Yes. But just before you went to Chicago, though, didn't you do some licensing in the state of Washington?
Well, that was when I worked for the child caring institutions and agencies, including the famous Diocese of Spokane, and including the Children's Home Society.
Yes. What condition did you find those programs in at the time?
Well, they were various. Some of them were quite, of course, Ryther was one of the ones that we licensed. And some of them had very archaic boards, but some of them were very progressive and doing some quite nice things with children. I think it was an easy generalization at that time that Seattle was very much more progressive than Spokane, which was really quite conservative and really reactionary.
And from a community organization standpoint, it was quite an outstanding city, I thought.
Seattle. I think so. I think there was a whole, I think at the times I worked there was a very hospitable atmosphere to social workers and a great deal of interest in social work as an enterprise.
And after leaving your job in Illinois, did you come directly to the University of Southern California?
Well, I was working there. I had published a paper in social casework jointly written with Ursula Freilich, who was a nurse there, a very attractive young person whose parents were professionals, I think, physicians who had been exterminated, and they'd lived in Berlin, and she had escaped, and she was making a new life for herself here. She had some sponsors. And Ursula and I wrote a paper together on dealing with children with physical disabilities. And I wrote a letter to Arlien. I had known her in Seattle.
This is Arlien Johnson.
Arlien Johnson, yes. I had supervised, as I mentioned, some students at University of Washington when she was dean there, and when I was in the Division for Children. She was also a neighbor of mine on Lake Union, and I remember her having her cozy cup of tea in the afternoon and always having her kittens.
She lived there with her cat, I remember.
Yes, she did. And I read an article in some journal about the Adoption Institute here. And again, I was kind of getting the yen to go back west. So I wrote to Arlien to ask her about that agency and what she thought of it, and they need staff and so on. And Arlien countered with an invitation to me to come and join the staff at USC. It was very simple in those days. She could make a unilateral decision about appointment and tenure and promotion.
I think she did very well with that.
She invited me to come and had a certain teaching load in mind for me, but in the meantime she had hired Martha Hartwell and transferred the load she had written me about to Martha and asked me to go and supervise a unit of students at Norwalk, now Metropolitan Hospital.
Yes.
Then Norwalk State Hospital.
Yes.
And I did do that for a couple of years.
How did you find the hospital when you went? Progressive or not?
Well, I thought it was rather primitive. They still had these staff meetings where a patient would be in to be presented to the whole staff on admission and on discharge. And I think most of the psychiatrists were quite mechanistic, and the social work program was just beginning to get underway.
Mm-hmm. And that's a very large hospital. Still functioning state. Have you visited in recent years?
No, I haven't seen it for a long time, and I don't know what kind of fluctuations it's gone through with all these changes in the mental health program and state hospitalization.
You're teaching SC. What were the courses you?
You remember when you and I taught practice and behavior, and
Yes.
all my practice students would be in your behavior class and vice versa?
That's right.
I always liked to teach first-year students because it was always new to them, and I think they learned very rapidly and were very engaged. Some of the second-year students were kind of jaundiced by the second year and
Yes.
kind of disengaged.
I always preferred the first-year students. Their enthusiasm and so forth is new to them.
Well, the wonder of learning something new and really
Yes.
learning to do something, that's very exciting, I think.
Yes, and entering a profession, a door to it.
One of the things that I look back on with interest, when I started to teach, I made a very strict point of addressing all my students as Miss or Mr. or Mrs. because I thought it accorded them their dignity as professional students.
Yes.
And by the time I finished teaching, if there was any student who didn't call me by my first name, it was because they didn't like me, I thought. There's a real cultural change in the naming
No, that's
over
true.
those years.
And that is particularly true in California and in Southern California.
I think we do more first naming than anybody.
Almost anywhere.
Yes.
You were supervising thesis writing at the time too, weren't you?
Yes, I began supervising some students, and mostly they were students who had their field placements in psychiatric settings and were writing on some aspect of their work there. All this time we were up on the top of Bobard. We had those long stairs to climb that kept us all in such robust health all these years, I do believe. Sitting in those splintered kitchen chairs,
Yes.
passing those telephones through from office to office.
If there's ever a poverty school, USC school was that at the
And
time.
Arlene had us using both sides of paper for scratch pads.
And one telephone for each two offices.
We really have seen those lean and Spartan days, have we not?
Yes, we have. How long had you taught at SC when you got your sabbatical and applied for a Fulbright? And
Well,
went to
actually,
Thailand?
you know, I didn't get a sabbatical. We heard that a sabbatical is a privilege, not a right. And but I had leave
Yes.
to go, and I had a great deal of interest in going overseas, and I had applied to United Kingdom. You know, Arlien Johnson went on her sabbatical in England just a year before I did, but those Fulbrights in the United Kingdom were very, very competitive and very always spoken for far in advance. At the same time, I had no language skill in any second language, but they wrote to me and said that there were opportunities in Thailand, and there was no language requirement because the students would all have had 12 years of English, and so the instruction would be in English. So it was a very, I filled out all those applications, and very exciting day. One day I got a cable and said, you start on June so-and-so, and your round-the-world air ticket is in the mail. And it was a first-class ticket, once in my life.
Exciting news. Very exciting news.
And I had a travel plan by which I went to Japan and Hong Kong on the way to Bangkok, and got a glimpse of those places.
Yes. Describe some of your experience in Bangkok.
Well, my housing there was quite interesting because I got my mentor there, opposite number, was a beautiful young woman who had gone to Ohio State and got a master's degree there. And she really kind of took charge of me, and she helped me with house hunting. And the place I eventually found was a beautiful little house in a compound with lagoons in it and flowering orchids and coconut trees. And this little house had been built by a Thai artist, a Thai architect who had studied in Paris. And we didn't have air conditioning, but it was all screened, and it had very wide eaves, and it didn't have to be shut up in a tropical storm, and it was always comfortable. And the big house across the lagoon was General Senadyad Herrick and his wife, and their 4 daughters, and a young son I never met. He was in school in Australia. But I settled in there and stayed the year there and lived very happily there. The teaching I did at the University of Thammasat, and that was the first year, and we designed some courses for students in the junior year. In the following year, Norma Mayfield followed me there, and the second year they had courses for juniors and courses for seniors, and tried to give them some introductory understanding of social problems in Thailand. I think probably we didn't do too good a job of adapting to their culture and understanding their culture. We tried, we were aware of it, but I don't know that we really did as well as I wished we would have done.
What were their social agencies like?
Well, they were very proud of their institutions, and they would take every tourist to see their institutions. And I was rather horrified of their infant care institution, because I could see the babies, being neglected and being perfect examples of what we always studied about, what happens to institutional children. And at the same time, I suppose it was better than infanticide and the babies drifting down the river.
Yes.
And it was the next step in that. But they had a great deal of distrust of any kind of foster family scheme or adoption, and were very much afraid that these children would be exploited and be made slaves. And I suppose that really would have happened too. Mm-hmm. So that they saw their institutions as really being protection for children who were abandoned.
The children were actually raised in the institution.
They were.
Any other kinds of programs there?
Yes, they had like the government social security program, so that they had they took care of elderly people, they took care of blind people, they took care of handicapped, disabled people. I worked about half of my time at the Ministry of the Interior, in which the Department of Public Welfare was part of that. And my Fulbright colleagues thought that I had the best experience of anybody who was there that year, and I know Jack Holden, who had come out from Dartmouth to teach political science, put in his final evaluation that every lecturer should have a ministry assignment, as I had, because he thought that I had so many more opportunities and got so much more out of being there that year than just teaching in the university.
That's where policies were essentially made in the ministry. You came home there with an award from some high-ranking officer, a beautiful silver bowl.
It's right there.
Yes.
And that bowl has little animals engraved around it that represent the years in the Thai cycle. The year of the rat, the year of the monkey. As all Oriental countries do. They're all a little different, I think, but this is the Thai cycle of years.
And who gave that to you?
The department.
But there was one high-ranking official, right?
Well, he was Kun Chat. He was the director of public welfare for the country.
That was a great experience to have been over
It was a wonderful experience. And then I had the opportunity to come home through other Asian countries and Middle Eastern countries and European countries, and it was really a great opportunity.
Wonderful experience. You returned to Los Angeles and USC and taught how long before you went away again?
Well, I came back in 55, and in 61, I took off and went to Cal. I had become very interested in cultural differences in child rearing, and proposed to Malcolm Stinson, who was by that time our dean. I think he'd been there a couple of years, and that I would like to go possibly to the Middle East and make a study of child rearing. And Malcolm, in his typical growl, as you may remember, said to me, you can go if you go and learn something. And I knew that meant one thing: go and get a doctorate. And I had considered this earlier, but never very seriously or very favorably. And I said, Malcolm, I don't want to go learn something because all the roads are littered with the blood and bones of people who've gone to learn something, because doctorates used to be very much an obstacle course, and the whole idea was to keep people from successful completion.
Yes.
And he said, well, don't go to one of those hidebound places like Chicago. Go to a new program where they've got new ideas like Cal. And that was the first year of Cal's program. And of course they were trying to prove something to all the other schools on the Cal campus and all the other schools of social work about how tough they could be. And they were tough. But it was I thought at the time I went there, a very good program, and I enjoyed it. And I thought it was a very marvelous opportunity. I did have an NIMH fellowship for the 2 years, so I was able to have the luxury of 2 years and nothing asked of me but to learn as well as I could, or as much as I could, and I really enjoyed it very, very much.
Dean Chernin was
there, and Dean Chernin and I had been on Dean Chernин's statewide committee on professional education, and he enjoyed, I think, pulling his rank on me now and then when I came in the role of a student.
He was making up for his lack of rank in the military when he was there. I think
went in as a private.
He was a private clear through the World War II.
He told me once or twice I wasn't humble enough.
I liked him.
Oh, he is a rare fellow.
Yes,
he was. Mad for Milton.
And it was at Berkeley that you met Bob Roberts, wasn't it?
It was at Berkeley I met Bob Roberts, and I got onto a dissertation topic which grew out of some interesting sociology seminars I took, and the concept of adult socialization was very interesting to me, and I believed that it could be applied in public assistance practice, because public assistance had always been a very great interest of mine. And Kermit Wilsey had a grant for a research projects office in Richmond, north of Berkeley, and so he was interested in my project. The whole purpose of this research projects office was for Cal to do research that would improve the practice in the public agencies in the state. And so my dissertation fit right in.
What is the exact title of your dissertation?
The title of my dissertation was a comparative analysis of social work practice in two types of AFDC families. And I had thought that social workers with a kind of a socialization orientation, that is, those who took a great deal of interest and were very helpful to the immediate problems and dilemmas of these families, would help them more than the ones who went in with a kind of a psychoanalytic orientation and were seeing them in terms of psychological problems and so on, which most of them wouldn't have been capable to help people with if they were on the right track with that. And Kermit Wilsey was looking for his most promising student of recent years to be his assistant, and he lighted on Bob Roberts. So Bob came there. We occupied a kind of a funny little storefront office in Richmond. Our secretary sat right up in the storefront, right up in the show window doing typing. And we had one student in the master's program, a young man working there that summer, so it was just the 5 of us. And I tried out my research instrument on this little group, and they came to my house one night and got into nearly a knockdown, drag-out battle over the meaning of this instrument and what they had done on it. Bob was always tangling with this very good secretary. They were kind of a match for each other. They both had great fettle, you know.
When you left Berkeley, you returned to USC?
Returned to USC, and about 4 years after that, I got my very, very first sabbatical. I was always in awe of Nora's class and how many sabbaticals he
Yes.
did. But of course, I'd been away, but I'd been on other kinds of leave. But I went to the Virgin Islands and had a project for working with nurses in the U.S. Public Health Service there. And I wanted to see how they taught their patients care of newborns, and how they taught handicapped or sick people self-care. And I thought they had something that social workers could learn from them. I also thought we had something that we could teach them. It was kind of an interaction. And that's the way I spent my months in St. Thomas. And, you know, we think of it as a kind of a vacation paradise, but actually the people there were living in degrees of extreme poverty. They were living in cardboard boxes and corrugated huts. And the people would come from the other islands, and they couldn't get any benefits, but they would still be better off than in the British Virgins or the Dutch or French Antilles. It was really a scene of incredible poverty for those people.
I guess those conditions have not changed much.
The man in charge of the public health department was Dr. Smith, and when I first presented myself to him, he said, "You can do anything you want and go anywhere you want, but you can't write anything," because someone had written a book about interpretation of dreams in Charles de Molière and published the book, and everyone was reading everyone else's dreams, and everyone knew whose dream it was. And Bob, by that year, was a doctoral student at Columbia, and Bob and Helen came down to visit me in the spring break.
This is Bob Roberts.
Bob Roberts. And I telling him this, and he had a very longing look in his eye and said, "Oh, for the security of a full professor to promise so blithely not to write anything."
Very good. Then you returned from there to USC?
I returned. I always came back to the West, and in the last half of my life, I always came back to USC.
It's true. Yeah. And you taught how long before you went to Australia?
Till my next sabbatical.
Yes.
Which was in
7 years.
74. And in the meantime, I had been involved in a research project which was very interesting at Rancho Los Amigos. And the county's rehabilitation hospital out in Downey. And over several summers there was a project.
Experience you've had in
Rancho.
Oh, at Rancho, yes.
And medical students who were ready for their final year, and therapy students, hospital administration students, and the plan was to get together a team of these students on each of several services so that they work together as a team with patients and families. And it was very interesting, and I think the staff were mentors for these students, so there were also mentor teams, and I think it really was a big step ahead for Rancho in the way all disciplines worked together and formed a team around the patient, and really understood and appreciated the contribution that each could make and the necessity for each one to help in this long haul of these disabled people going through their rehabilitation.
And Rancho is a Los Angeles County public institution,
it's
isn't
part
it?
of the,
yes.
The county hospital system. And the people, Dr. John Beeton, a public health physician, had got a Commonwealth grant for this research, and Betty Yerxa, who later became chair of occupational therapy, had a grant from the Department of Health and Human Services, and they just put their grants together, and what one couldn't do, the other could, and it made it remarkably flexible for programs.
Yes. Very good. I've kept a long time interest in that rehabilitation center.
And one of the things that I think was introduced was really having the patient be very much a part of all the planning and all the staff meetings, and really no secrets hidden from the patient. We had one young man who had become quadriplegic in a swimming pool in a diving accident about the time the group was starting, and this young team had worked with him through the summer very intensively. They were age peers, and he came to the final presentation. His wife was with him, and he took part in it. and presented his part and what he'd done in his rehabilitation, and he says, and I couldn't have done it without you guys.
Wonderful. It's a great compliment, and thank you. What caused your decision to take your sabbatical in Australia?
Well, that was an outgrowth of the Rancho experience.
That's what I thought.
Yes. We had worked a lot with an orthopedic surgeon out there. His name was Vern Nichols, and we all called him Big Nick. And he came striding into my office one day and said, now, I'm just back from Royal Perth Hospital, and they really need social workers. Have you got any students you can send me? And I said, well, I would look around, which I did. I came upon one couple who might have gone, but they had very strict dog quarantine laws, and they couldn't part with their dog. But I said, meanwhile, I'd go myself because I have a sabbatical coming up, and I'd be very interested in doing that. So and I got a letter of invitation from Royal Perth Hospital to come and be visiting professor in social work that semester, and live in the guest suite in the hospital. And that was a very interesting experience.
Oh, yes. Tell me more about that.
Well, what I tried to do was to help workers who were beginning to organize groups of certain patients. And the other thing I tried to do was help them get started with some research projects in the hospital. I think the social service department had not done any research, and they needed to do something, I think, to be respectable, to show that they were evaluating what they were doing and could account for some of the results. And so that was my role at Royal Perth.
Yes. Did you have the opportunity to learn about some of the other social service programs in Perth?
I really didn't get out of the hospital a great deal or into the community. It was quite intensive. I lived there, and one of the things I did was to go into the emergency receiving room on weekends whenever I was free, and really start the social service in the emergency department, and as a student took it over, and I think they had social work from then on, but especially the families who'd come in with a badly injured person were just left sitting in a waiting room, or people who came in to identify someone who'd been dead on arrival. There was no provision for them at all. And I think that there would just be someone there who would really understand and communicate an understanding of what they were going through without making demands.
Yes. They have a variety of ethnic groups as patients?
Not only as patients, Australia used to have very high barriers to anyone except Caucasians, but that has changed. They have had enormous waves of immigration from Italy and from Greece. There are more Greeks in Melbourne, I heard, than in Athens. But just before I went, it opened up really to all of Orient, and there were a great many Malaysians. I think they had a very good nursing school at Royal Perth, and that year there were more students from Malaysia than from anywhere else in the graduating class from the nursing
That's very
school.
interesting. That was any work done with the Ao Nagas or the primitive tribes in Australia?
The Aboriginals.
The Aboriginals.
some Aboriginal patients would come into emergency with, cut up in fights, and I think they had many of the problems that our American Indians have of having a culture superimposed on them and being exposed to alcohol. And there were severe problems of alcoholism and violence when those people would come into the cities. And they were homeless, they had no shelter in the cities. And
Yes,
so on.
yes.
And I saw that when I went back. In the children's hospital, most of the patients were Aboriginal, and they would get exquisite care and go out healthy and go home and come back again sick from neglect and so on. And one of the doctors was very sympathetic. He said he'd gone through exactly that when he was in the Army, and the only place he could be well was in the hospital and go out to the front lines and be so exposed and so neglected that he would always get sick again. Aboriginal children were like soldiers on the front line.
No, I know. It's just from reading that's very primitive. You return to SC then again?
This is getting monotonous now. Always returning to SC.
Sound like a educational yo-yo.
The old refrain, return to SC.
But once you returned, your adventures didn't end. And I remember that you and Frances Feldman had an assignment in Alaska. Would you tell us about that?
Well, that was really before that sabbatical, I think.
Oh, was it before?
Yeah, I think so. And Frances done a million things and done a lot of grant research and so on. And this time she had a contract to evaluate a training program for Native workers in the villages in the river valleys, the Yukon and the Kuskokwim River. And so she came to get one of the students I was working with on dissertation to go up and assist her, and I put my foot, it was Win Tabbert, I put my foot down and said, Win can't go gallivanting off anywhere. She has got to finish her dissertation. And so Frances said, if you won't let Win go, come yourself. And so again I substituted for a student and went up and assisted Frances. And we did have some very adventurous times up there, including staying overnight in the welfare office and climbing through the court to take a shower in the prison, and our quarters on the floor were more comfortable really than if we'd had a room at the Tilton Hilton that had sloping floors and bed springs that would stab you in the back. And our headquarters when we went up there were very, really kind of primitive city where I'll tell you the name of it. We always went back to Bethel in the...
That was where the headquarters were in Bethel.
Well, that was the headquarters for these river villages, kind of. And no, the state government major offices were in Juneau and Anchorage. Our headquarters was certainly Bethel. And that was the town where the leading cause of death was said to be drunken motorboat driving. And you could see that if you got out on that river all bundled up and were so unfortunate as to run into something, you'd really sink with your clothes on. You wouldn't have a chance in the temperature and the heavy clothes. And there was a great deal of alcoholism there.
And your purpose, in that research was to make recommendations?
Yes, it was really to evaluate the training program, and here again we found that training programs for more sophisticated communities had been really transplanted kind of, as I would think, quite thoughtlessly and without reference to the limited resources in some of those villages. And I think we were able to, even in the evaluation process, help certainly some of those the village workers who were quite capable young people, some of them, to and they were quite, they had a lot of initiative themselves, and did things like having the boats rerouted so they give people better service or bring in better supplies and so on.
And were these Eskimos? The natives. And were there any natives who had graduate school education in social work? Any of the Eskimos that you knew of?
There might have been one or two, and I think there were some that had gone to school and gone back to Juneau or Anchorage. And it seems to me there was possibly one worker out there who had had some education down in the lower 48 somewhere.
I see. When I went to ask Maury Hamovich for my, we've really gone through a whole lot of deans, haven't we? Yes.
He was dean by this time. By the time I went to Royal Perth, for this sabbatical, my second and last sabbatical, I pointed out to him that I would have to go that year, that was 74, because I understood I would have to work, everyone had to work a year after sabbatical, and in 2 years I would be retiring, and that did give him a kind of a jolt. So I did come back and work another year, and then I taught some classes. And by this time, Bob Roberts, no, I guess they had asked me to come back to wait, and I had said, Bob Roberts, by this time he had come to SC, and I had said that they wanted someone to teach research, and I said he had a sabbatical coming up, and he could really teach research superbly well. So Bob got over there, and he nudged them, I guess, to ask me back again.
Yes.
So that's when I went a second time after I had retired and taught there for 2 years at the WAIT. It's a nice acronym. It's the Western Australian Institute of Technology. It has now become CUT, the Curtin Institute of Technology, Curtin University of Technology.
That's an interesting title. It really is. And what all did you do there, Miss, particularly?
Well, I taught practice, and they have a kind of a block fieldwork plan there, and there some it's an undergraduate program. There are always some students in the class and some out in their block placements in the field. I really came to know the community and the social agencies in the community much better at WAIT than I ever had at Royal Perth. I was really, I guess, looking pretty much inward during that time I was at Perth, and really stayed downtown. I lived there. I lived in the hospital and worked in the hospital, and I didn't have a car. And when I taught at WAIT, I was much more far-ranging and got to know the agencies and the agencies where students were doing their field work.
What you call your retirement was what year?
Well, I last taught full-time in 75, and I taught part-time then for a couple of years until I went to Australia in 77.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
You've done quite a lot of work with the Counseling Center at the University of Southern
Yes.
California.
Uh-huh.
Would you explain what that is and
Well,
what you did?
this was organized, and I'm sure the origin of this is detailed on Frances' tape. She started it, and I became one of the counselors and a consultant in the counseling service. And this was at the time the occupational social work concentration was getting started in the school. And the counseling center was conceived as part of the plan, which was research and education and practice, or service really to the university. And it was funded as one of the staff benefits, and I really liked that. I liked working with people who came there as a matter of right, and they didn't have to establish any eligibility except the fact that they were on the university payroll. And that, I think, gave a certain psychological assurance to people in coming there to ask for help. And also, people that were really, no matter, some of them had very grave problems, they were organized enough to get themselves to work every day and hold on to a job. Some of them had very serious problems in the family.
Yes.
Some in the second generation coming along had got onto drugs, and there was we saw a great many young people that kind of problem.
This served the entire staff of the university, including
Faculty and staff.
yes, maintenance people and
Maintenance people. There was an enormous range of people. From I was seeing a visiting scholar from Oxford once, and I was seeing a gardener who had very little English language facility. I really should have been able to talk Spanish to see him. And I think we did transfer him to a Spanish-speaking worker. I think you saw some members of the administration
I
there.
saw one of the
didn't you?
vice presidents. Well, that's been a successful program. You also worked some with the health unit at USC. The student health.
I never worked with student health. I spent some time in Women's Hospital one semester. I was interested in really a patient's eye view of who in this vast apparatus had helped them in any way that really came through to them with meaning and mattered and made a difference. And I interviewed a great many patients on the oncology service and on the therapeutic abortion service, because it seemed to me that these were extremes of conditions over which patients had some control themselves. And the oncology service was a great place for staff to get burnout. It was very demanding and very harsh for people to work there, to see this steady procession of patients having radical surgery, having other radical kinds of treatment. And it was interesting that devout Catholics seemed to hold up the best in staff. You really could turn to their faith and draw sustenance, draw encouragement from their faith in a way that people without that faith had nowhere comparable to turn to. And I think part of the testimony I got from patients was that nurses made a great deal of difference to them. One young mother told me that the days were fairly busy and fairly full of people coming and going and some distraction, but at night, when you're really frightened and all alone, there was a nurse. There would be a nurse who was always there. You could talk to and share your fears and anxieties with.
Yes, very important. You have an excellent reputation as both a writer and as an editor of other people's writing.
Oh.
And I know that you've been the editor of the social work papers for the School of Social Work at SC. And would you comment on that?
All right. This was a gleam in Arlien Johnson's eye, and we really got out I was editor of the first 5 volumes, starting in 1953. And we really had to find out everything for the first time about how to go about doing this, getting the articles and getting the journal produced. And then Frances took over the editing for a number of years. And then Bob edited one volume on adoptions. I know you did a paper for that.
Yes.
Then I picked it up again, and I have edited about 5 or 6 since I've come back from Australia. And one on family treatment, and one our alumnus up in Saskatchewan wanted to do something with the school, and I think Bob suggested that that agency up there child welfare agency might finance one issue of social work papers. So we brought out an issue on child welfare in Canada, and all the authors were Canadians.
That's a quarterly journal, isn't it?
It's an annual.
Annual.
It comes out once a year. And the last 4 issues have been devoted to industrial social work.
Yes.
That was about the time that the industrial social work was getting underway, and it seemed appropriate that our school's journal should also be devoted to this subject.
You've written a great many papers over the years that have been published in journals. I wonder why you've never written a book.
Well, I think that Mr. John Moore of the Columbia Press would have liked me to write a book on socialization, and invited me to submit. And I hate to say it, but I guess the real reason is that I was too lazy.
I don't believe that.
Didn't get myself well enough organized to really come out with a book. A book is terribly hard work, and people who write books, I think, give their all to it.
Yes.
Really get submerged in it and submersed.
That's true.
And I never, I guess, was quite able to do that. Sorry about that.
Well, your career is still going as a volunteer in community activities in Pasadena, Los Angeles area. Would you like to tell what you're doing in 1988?
Yes. When I came back from Australia, I'd been a kind of a sometime member of the League of Women Voters for a while, and I decided that I should really become more active and try to make more of a contribution to the organization. So I filled out a form that they ask every member to fill out. It's for what they call their skills bank, to tell what your experience and interests are. And my friend Bonnie Armstrong got hold of that and kind of recruited me, and I've never been quite the same since. But anyway, I became the social policy chair simultaneously for the League in Los Angeles County and in the Pasadena area, which is a mistake because those two posts are incompatible, if only from a standpoint of time conflict and meeting schedules and so on. So I dropped out of the county and continued in the Pasadena Area League, although I have continued to monitor the GAIN program and report on it for the county voter. That's the Greater Avenues to Independence, the workfare program that is proposed to replace AFDC. It's cited from all over the country as a model program, but from where we are, we can see a lot of warts on it. And the League has been quite vocal in this and has really taken exception to three things. One is the mandatory nature of the program. It would be much more successful if it were voluntary.
Yes.
And especially center on people just coming onto the program. Instead, it's really making it mandatory for people who've been on for many years. Then they really had no idea of how to have input in the planning from people in the community. And they have what they call community meetings, but these are always just sessions in which a report is given as what has been done, and it's all set in concrete, at that time. And the other serious problem is the fact that there's a very heavy dependence on unlicensed daycare, and there is really no provision for when this program gets going in a big way. It'll flood the child care system with children to be cared for, and I think this is not being dealt with very realistically. I, as a representative from the League, I have attended quite regularly a group in Pasadena that is called the Youth Agencies Consortium. It's representatives from all the youth serving agencies in the area, and they have a monthly meeting. Many of these are really frontline workers, and they discuss some of their problems and especially look at how they can coordinate on some of the problems they're all facing. Of course, I think one of the serious problems in any Southern California community is always transportation. And getting children to programs and transportation for parents, and some child care or after school programs, working parents would be sending their kids in cabs to go to it, which they couldn't afford. And the Youth Agencies Consortium is really working on trying to make use of school buses and adjust schedules and routes so that children can go to after-school programs on their school buses rather than just go home where there's no care for them and so on. And another thing they've been very concerned about this year is the growing amount of forms and things to be filled out, and it's very frustrating for them to feel that they spend such a large proportion of their time with this and so little really helping the children or doing what they've been trained to do. And I have been asked to go onto the board of the Youth Agencies Consortium. I was appointed to the Child Care Coalition, Pasadena Child Care Coalition, and have worked quite consistently in that during this year. We wrote a child care policy for the city of Pasadena, which calls for the city to be a model employer and have a progressive family economic policy. I've really had to talk quite hard and sometimes to unsympathetic ears for parental leave policies. It seems to me that this is a much more suitable way of dealing, especially with infant care and having the infants cared for away from home and in these centers and so forth.
Yes.
Then just this summer I have gone on the board of the Visiting Nurse Association. When I look back, it seems to me that I have had quite a lot of co-working relationships with nurses, beginning with Ursula Freilich at Herrick House and at Women's Hospital and in the Rancho program and in Virgin Islands.
Yes.
And the visiting nurse program here has some interesting innovations, including a hospice program and a respite program, and I'm really very interested in what they're doing and would like to try to be useful to that agency.
Continue to be very active. There's no retirement.
Well, you know, I guess we get to the point where we feel guilty if we're just lazing around for week after week after
We're
week.
raising the wrong generation.
Yeah, we've got too much of that work ethic, I guess we have.
In looking back on your career, have you ever regretted that you became a social worker?
Well, I'll tell you. I can remember a terrible pang of regret in Aberdeen, in Grays Harbor County, where I was just starting to develop foster homes and a foster home program, and had made what seemed to be a good placement for a rather troubled lad, and it blew up and there was just no place for him to go. And I can remember walking down the street and feeling really desperate and thinking I really should have a job peeling potatoes or something like that. It wouldn't be subject to this kind of stress and anxiety. But in all the years since, I can't remember being, a feeling of being overwhelmed like that and inadequate to the
Yes.
to the emergency.
That's part of the learning
Part of, I guess, getting.
experiences.
And that Grays Harbor was a very primitive community. There wasn't much to fall back on in the way of
Yes.
resources, or referrals or anything.
I think we've all had instances in our lives when that happens. Well, you've had an extremely interesting and valuable
I'm glad
career.
that there's some social work in our family, that my nephew Bill is a social worker in Vermont. And I think young Kelly is sort of headed in that direction. If she hasn't, she's now been part of a demonstration for the homeless that landed her in jail, and if she's figuring on spending her junior year with Mother Teresa in Calcutta.
Yes, that's your niece, Kelly.
That's Doug's daughter, my
Yes.
grandniece, yes.
Is there anything you'd like to add to what we've talked about?
Well, we didn't talk about the cancer study. And
No, we didn't.
Actually, Frances did published three studies of, the first was, they were all on work careers after treatment for cancer. You did some interviews on that as well, didn't you?
Yes, I did.
And the first one was managerial and professional people, because that formed a kind of a baseline. They were seen as those who would have the best opportunity to return to work and so on. The second study was on blue-collar workers, and the third study was on young workers who had cancer at the point of before getting a first job, or how it would affect vacation or part-time work and so on. I interviewed a great many people in each of those three studies, and helped with the writing of some of the reports. The studies were really very fascinating. The people we interviewed were very fascinating. Most of them had enormous courage, and they were meeting, some of them had no trouble, but some of them were meeting with very medieval kinds of prejudice in the workplace, and people being afraid they'd catch cancer from them and avoiding them, and so on. And one of the things I came out of that brought out of that was a tremendous conviction about the importance of work in the lives of people. And I remember a woman in the blue-collar study, and she had a kind of a nothing job. I think she was in some chain store and working in one of the departments, and her children were grown. Her husband was away at work all day, every day, and she said, what would become of me if I didn't have my job? She just couldn't have faced she said, the people you work with, you spend more of your waking hours with them than you do with your family. And she had gone back to work successfully, but she hadn't always been sure that she could or would be accepted back, and the fear of not going back had been very devastating to her. And it was very reassuring that she could go back, and I really became impressed with how important people's work is to them, and how really lucky we are to have had work that we like doing.
Yes.
And how much frustration and monotony there is in many people's work. They're really deprived in their work lives.
Dr. Freud's remedy is love and work. That's certainly true.
And half of that message has been overlooked for many years.
Yes.
There's been an awful lot of interest and investigation in the love part, but the work part hasn't fascinated people quite that much.
It really hasn't. The cancer study was sponsored by the American Cancer Society and a joint project with our school, or was it separate from the school?
Well, I think it was, I'm not sure what the role of the school was, but I think it was pretty much a Frances enterprise.
Yes, yes.
And in the beginning, it was Al who was going to do that. And
this is Al Feldman.
Al Feldman, and Frances was going to assist him, and it was something that was going to be his retirement project, kind of. And then, of course, Al died, and Frances carried on with it. But the very first meeting we had with a group of people who'd had cancer. It was out in the San Fernando Valley, and Frances and Al and I went out there and had this group meeting with people.
I didn't realize it was that long ago. Yes. Well, Elizabeth, or Lisa,
All right.
as everyone calls you,
As my Thai protector.
we'll pause for the present, but if you think of other things, I will add them to the tape as we go
I have to
along.
put a note about Lisa, my landlord's daughter, who was an attorney and guided me in everything I did in Bangkok, said to me very early, her name was Sunong Senandyad Herrocks, and she said, Elizabeth is a very heathen, unpronounceable name. Is it all right if I call you Lisa? And I wrote this to people at SC, and they began addressing me as Lisa and referring to me as Lisa, and ever since I came back, I was always Lisa.
Yes.
Mostly at SC.
Isn't that interesting?
Not other places.
Because I thought you probably had that at school.
Someone once said to me, "Are only people at SC allowed to call you Lisa?"
Very good. In ending, Lisa, you said there are two persons you'd like to mention.
That's right. And the first one is Henry Maas. When I was going to go to Cal, Arlien Johnson said to me, "Don't let just anyone be your advisor up there. Demand to have Henry Maas." And this bemused me because I thought how Arlene would have reacted if she could have heard anyone advising a prospective doctoral candidate to our school in that way. But as it happened, I went to Cal, and Henry Maas was indeed my advisor. And I can't say too much for him, what he did as a friend and intellectually, and just the sheer pleasure of his company. He was very stimulating. He was with me every step of the way, and when I sent the draft of my dissertation to him, he phoned me and addressed me as doctor. I didn't even know who was calling me. But he is a great man, and I appreciate him very much. The other person is Rino Patti, who has just arrived as the 5th Dean of the School of Social Work at SC. Rino Patti came into the master's program. He and Nadine were in my casework class. They came and told me they planned to be married at the end of that year. I told them to run and not walk and announce this to Arlien Johnson, because if she heard it from them directly, she would forgive them, but if she heard it at second hand, she would not. And they did announce it to her, and she did forgive them. Rino was subsequently in my doctoral seminar, and has now, in August '88, returned as the 5th Dean of the School of Social Work. I have known them all, and I think Rino is in the great tradition. I'm very proud of him, and I think he will be a great dean.